Thank you, John, for taking class for the last couple of times. I did have a chance to listen, so excellent both times. And John had the opportunity on Sunday to introduce David into our study of 1 Samuel. And so we're going to look at the latter half of chapter 16, 17. If we get into 18, that's great. Chapter 17 is actually pretty long, 58 verses, but it tells a story that I think we all know. Before we get to that, let me ask a question, and I'll have you just throw somebody out. Name for me somebody that you consider to be great, and by great I mean great leadership, and that can be, in any genre, political or historical or whatever. Name for me somebody who's great. Who? No, I'm modern history. Name somebody great in modern history, this century or last century. Okay, that's 2 centuries ago, but okay, let's go there. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a great leader. Why? What made Abraham Lincoln great? What do we know about him? What do we remember about him that makes him great? Yeah, go ahead.
He freed the slaves.
Okay, you could say, yeah, in a historical sense, he freed the slaves. He certainly was the leader of our country during the time in which that happened. There's a lot of context to that simple statement, but yes, you could say that's one of the things we remember him for. Okay, what else? What made him great?
Made Abraham Lincoln great was he persevered through many failures before he achieved greatness.
He achieved great things after having failed in very personal ways. Okay? Very good. What else? What else made him great? What about his physical appearance? What was Abraham Lincoln's physical appearance in contrast to most everybody else during his day? He was tall. Yeah, kind of like Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else. And to accentuate or accessorize his tallness, he wore a really big hat, right? Okay? What stories do we have about him? What did he like to do by the fireside? Go ahead, Brett in the back.
I was just going to say he was also really well known for being honest, truthful, and just his overall character, treating everyone that he came across with great respect.
Okay. A lot of people didn't like him, though. I mean, the fact that he was inaugurated as president is what led to secession of many states, perhaps because they misunderstood what his intent was regarding slavery, or maybe they knew exactly what his intent was. I don't want to have a complete historical review of that. I want us to look at somebody in modern history and think about why they were great and what got them to that point. And this is what Lawrence O. Richards says about greatness in his commentary on 1 Samuel. Greatness is something many people desire, but few understand. Usually we recognize the great only after they have achieved, and I think this is true for Abraham Lincoln. Usually we recognize the great only after they have achieved. We call them great after their military victories have been won, or their administrative skills have brought success, or their talents have gained rewards. What we see is the finished product. not the process. And so we tend to romanticize greatness. The same thing happens in the Christian realm. The new believer who dreams of the day he will do great things for God, or the individual who yearns for the day he will live a victorious life, have both romanticized spiritual greatness. They have missed the point that quality and character are forged in experience. Greatness comes only through a process that always contains an element of pain. And the reason I mention this is, as we start to talk about David, and John introduced this a little bit on Sunday, is the last half of 1 Samuel, all the rest of the chapters we're going to look at, are, I would call them a master's class in how God trains someone for leadership. And the subject of that training is David. All the rest of what we're going to read about in this first book, now there's a whole lot more to David than just the process of becoming great. And there is a foundational element to that we already know. And that is that David, this scripture says, David had a heart, was a heart after God, or a man after God's own heart. And we see that in his appointment, or his anointment as king. In chapter 16, verse 10, it says, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? And then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And so he sent and brought him in, and now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good-looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit, this is important, okay, later on in chapter 17. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And so Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Okay, so here we are with David being anointed king. Now, who knows that he's been anointed king? Samuel and Dad and the brothers, the people that were there to witness this. Okay, and what was Samuel afraid of earlier in chapter 16? Yeah, Saul's going to kill him. If Saul finds out he's anointed someone else to be king, we all know about Saul and Saul's neuroses. So that's what Samuel's afraid of. It never really says that, but it makes sense because we know, what the character of Saul was. Okay. Now, in contrast, well, not really in contrast, in a similar way, when Samuel anoints Saul as king, no one really knows about that particular incident until Samuel calls out Saul later in front of all the people. So the same process here is at work. God has chosen, Samuel anoints with oil, and it's all a very private thing, at least initially. Now, chapter 17. What we find in chapter 17 is this, not really to make light of it, but to make it very simple, because we're going to come back and look at these details later. To make it really simple, you have chapter 17, you have the incident with the giant and David. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, because we'll come back and look at the details. But there is something here, and it starts here in the last part of chapter 16. And it's a chronology thing, and it just kind of bothers me. And that is this. Is the sequence of things here correct? Is the chronological order of these events all correct from 16 to 17 to 18? Okay, is it written that way? It bothers me because it doesn't seem like it is. And why that bothers me is because I will go back and I will tell you, you read Genesis chapter 1, and Genesis chapter 1, you take it as it's written. You take it literally. If God said he made such and such on day 1 and day 2, and there was morning and evening, you take that literally, it's 24-hour days, right? So I would be of the opinion that you need to read Genesis very literally, and you need to take it very literally. Well, the same would be true in 1 Samuel, except the chronology here of these things don't quite add up. And this is what I'm talking about. You have the incident with the giant. Okay, before the incident with the giant, you have this record of this, the distressing spirit that comes upon Saul. How do they soothe Saul and this distressing spirit? Well, they bring in the son of Jesse to play the harp with him. So in verse 17 it says, Saul said to his servants, provide now for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me. And then one of the servants answered and said, look, I've seen the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and handsome in person. The Lord is with him. And therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them by his son to Saul, sent him as gifts. And he sent his son to play the harp for Saul as a soothing when he has this distressing spirit. Now, if this happens before the incident with the giant, how is it that Saul doesn't know David when David comes to the battlefield to fight Goliath? Are these things out of chronological order? Because if you skip all the way over to 18, it says in verse 2, Saul took him that day, took David, this is after the thing with the giant, took David and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. And then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him of his own. And Jonathan took off the robe that was with him and gave it to David. So we have the thing about Jonathan there. And then in chapter 17, verse 15, it says, David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, if I just take all this at face value, it appears to me that before the thing with the giant, David went to the house of Saul to soothe him with his harp. And then he would come and go from Saul's house and return to his father's house. Remember, Bethlehem and, well, I was going to say Bethlehem and Jerusalem are really close, but Saul's not in Jerusalem. Nobody's in Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in a minute. Apparently, let's say this, apparently Bethlehem is very close to where Saul was living or housed as king. But David would go back and forth. And then at the end of 17, it says, when Saul saw David, I'm going to give away what happens with the giant if you don't already know. Okay, so this is a spoiler. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, and said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And so the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. And then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Yeah, give it away what happens with Goliath. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And so David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. How does Saul not know him? How does Abner not know him? He's already been in the house of Saul playing the harp and soothing Saul's distressing spirit. Okay, so this troubles me just a little. Because I would read chapter 16 before chapter 17, before chapter 18. In my mind, these things all have to happen chronologically in order. If I read the text as it is written, and I take it at its face value, which is what I would tell you to do with other scriptures and a whole lot of other places. Yes, I know there is some scripture that is meant to be symbolic, okay? But I would tell you to take most scripture as literal, especially Genesis. All of that's history. So if I take this literally, then there has to be some explanation for why Saul doesn't seem to know the harp player that he sent for, and Saul knows the name of his father and knows his family and knows who he is. What's going on here? Why does this happen? And so before we talk about David and Goliath, I have to square this in my mind. And the verse that troubles me most, if this is actually in chronological order, is verse 18 of chapter 16, where one of Saul's servants says, "Look, I've seen the son of Jesse, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor." I can explain that, I think. A man of war. I don't know how to explain that. Prudent in speech and a handsome person. Okay, so these are some characteristics that are said of David. Skillful in playing, that seems to go without saying. Playing the harp. We know David was a musician just by what we see in the Psalms. He was not only able to play, but able to compose, and quite likely played a lot of what he composed. So he was able to play soothingly. That seems to be without argument. A man of valor. Okay, that I think I can explain. And we can explain that, I think, this way. When David is brought before Saul, and I know I'm skipping around here a lot in the details, in chapter 17, the thing with the giant. David's brought before Saul because David basically says, is anybody going to challenge this guy? Is anybody going to go out and fight him? Why are we going to let Goliath the Philistine stand and defy the armies of God? Or defy the armies of God? Somebody has to do something about this. And so they bring David before Saul. Verse 33, Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and I struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of those, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God." Okay, so this reputation could be known, that David was a valiant shepherd and that he put his life on the line for his father's sheep. And that would match the servant of Saul's description of him being a man of valor, would it not? Everybody with me so far? Okay. So remember, I'm trying to explain how these things could be in chronological order in 1 Samuel. Because the historian in me you got to make this work, or just it has to work for me. Okay, that's because that's the way I am. Okay, so I get that one description. Now, this other one, the playing the harp, yep, that's good. The part about a person of valor, a man of valor, could come from this idea that he is the excellent shepherd, the one who protects the sheep, the one who puts his life on the line for the sheep. And then the other thing the servant says is a man of war. Okay, how can this be as a youth? Where would David get the reputation of being a man of war? Unless this is not happening in chronological order. If this description of him as a great harp player happens after the thing with Goliath, then it's obvious a man of war, a man of valor. Those things would be obvious. How would this be a description that fits David if verse 18 actually is before the incident with Goliath? Go ahead.
One possibility, it's not written to be recorded, but we know that there were enemies around who might attempt to attack even his family or whatever. The the flock or whatever, where the family itself and servants might go out against them and they saw there how he fought. I mean,
There could be incidents that are known about the sons of Jesse fighting enemies around, okay, of which David may have had part of that. We don't have any of that recorded in Scripture. It is one possibility. And I think there's a good piece of evidence that points to that potential explanation. And that's this. So David's keeping the sheep of his father Jesse, and in my explanation of the order of things, this would be in one of those times where he's gone back to Bethlehem from the house of Saul. So he's gone back and forth, and so he's gone back and he's watching the sheep, and of course Saul with the army is in the field ready to fight. And so Jesse says, "Take these provisions and go check on your brothers." Okay. I'm looking for where the verse is. Verse 13, the three oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle, and the name of these three who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn next to him, and Abinadab, and then Samiah. And David was the youngest, and the three oldest followed Saul, and David occasionally went and returned to Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. And Jesse said to his son, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news to me." Okay? So David's given a mission. He goes out to the field. Now, while he's out there, he sees Goliath come and present himself and challenge the army and defy the Israelites on one of these. And it says this happens every day. This is going on for a month, over a month, 40 days it says. Which is a little hard to explain. I don't know how you keep an army in the field, two armies in the field facing each other, and having the giant come out and challenge for 40 days and not have, the armies run away or something. I don't know how that happens, but so this has been going on for a while. Okay, David's here. David hears the challenge. Verse 26, it says, David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" We'll come back to this. And the people answered him in this manner, "And so it shall be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, when he spoke to the men, and Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle." Okay. Now remember that one of the descriptions of the servant of Saul about David is that he is a man of war. If I take Eliab's comment, his oldest brother's comment, at its face value, what does David like to appear to be? What does David talk about? What does David, what persona does he try to put on? That he's a man of war, that he's come to see the battle. He must talk about battles, must like to see battles, thinks he could be great in a battle. Okay, so without saying that David is being dishonest in promoting himself as a man of war, here is somebody who likes to be around battles, who likes to see things, according to his older brother. And I can understand his older brother's frustration with the younger brother. Why are you here? Why are you here? Why? And I think the reality of Eliab lashing out is, why are you here to see us afraid of the giant, is really, I think, what's happening. But is it possible that because of this perception of David, word has gotten out? And maybe there was battle. Maybe there has been battles. Maybe David has been successful in battle. He certainly has killed wildlife that could easily take him down in his explanation to Saul. And so it kind of fits. It still bothers me a little, but it kind of fits that the servant would think of David as a man of valor and a man of war. Because obviously his brothers are men of war. They've come to be with Saul in the army. So maybe it's a family reputation that they are men of war, or they are men of battle, because the older sons obviously are, and Saul has brought them in. And so then you get to the, now you have the, you kind of answered that description. You get to the idea, how did Saul not know him? Well, there's all kinds of answers for that. Saul had a distressing spirit from the Lord. Saul may not have been in his right mind at the time of Goliath. He was certainly afraid. Here is Saul, the king of Israel, the man who stands head and shoulders above everybody else in his army, and even he's afraid to go and fight Goliath. And so wouldn't the distressing spirit be heavily upon him because of that, that fear? Possibly. Perhaps because of what is promised to the man who kills Goliath, Saul is just trying to ascertain who gets the reward. Maybe that's where the question comes: whose family is this youth? Who is this youth's family? Who's his father? Maybe it's a simple question to ascertain where the reward goes. Maybe this is several years of coming and going, David coming and going from Saul to Jesse to Saul, back to feed the sheep, and so his physical appearance has changed. Maybe Saul doesn't recognize him. Or, and I think this is the most likely, after David defeats Goliath, and we're going to go back and pick up a couple of those things here in a minute. After David defeats Goliath, Saul's got to find some way to save face, right? I mean, now we've had this ruddy, good-looking, beautiful-eyed youth come in and take down the giant Goliath, and this precipitates the slaughter of the Philistines, and Saul didn't have anything to do with it. And so Saul's got to save face somehow. Well, whose son is this? Who is this youth? You notice he calls him a youth. Who are you, youth? Almost as a derogatory term, the word youth. And further, in chapter 18, it says, Saul took him after David takes out Goliath. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Why? This one's pretty obvious to me. It becomes obvious because of what happens afterwards. Why did Saul take David after this battle with the Philistines and the death of Goliath? Why did Saul take David and not let him go home to Jesse anymore?
Keep your friends close, your enemies close.
Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Yeah, he wanted to keep his eye on David, because David's already upstaged him once, and it's going to happen a lot more. And so these are all explanations as to why David, or why Saul may appear, based on his questions and his conversation with Abner about, did he know David or not know? Should he have known David? Well, there's all kinds of explanations. And hang on just a second. And one of the most, I think, probably one of the most important explanations is this, and it doesn't really satisfy me a lot, but ancient writers, certainly the writer of 1 Samuel, didn't really care about the chronological timeline of the events. And while that's really important to me, it wasn't very important to him. And so I just kind of got to get over that. Go ahead, John.
Your last point. Being a social scientist myself, most melancholy minds that look at history, and most traditional teaching of history, chronology is so important. These dates are so important that you memorize them in order.
Right.
but true social science looks at the relevance of events and how they relate to one another. And this is true in the Bible as well. There are many events, for example, in the New Testament, that the gospel writers write similar events and not necessarily in the same chronological order. They don't report them the same way.
The Gospel of John drives me crazy.
Yeah, but that they write them in relevance to the subject at hand. And I think this is a case where the writer of Samuel writes these events as they're relevant to what he's talking about here at the end of chapter 16, contrasting Saul's state of mind with David's state of mind, and comparing these two kings in their early relationship. And so then he relates that instance where David becomes that sound mind in contrast to Saul's crazy state of mind, if you will. And then he goes on to tell the story
About David and Goliath. Yep. And I think
That's the best explanation for how we read this sequence, is that the story is told to highlight certain things about David and about Saul at various times. And chronological order, forget it. I mean, there are something more important. The writer has seen it more important to make these points. Hang on one second. Behind you. Go ahead.
And this is also being edited to a post-Babylonian exile audience. So I think the elevation of David's kingship and of the reign of Israel as true kingdom is really important to that audience. It's going back to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. So maybe even an editor.
Right, and not
David wasn't even that.
not only that, not only are we talking about editing for
Post-Babylonian captivity, we're talking about editing for historical precedents post-Christ crucifixion, which that's us, right? So we're part of this this editing too. And the point I wanted to take from that is there's all kinds of practical applications in these verses, particularly in David and Goliath. Go ahead, John, before I go to that.
Well, I think this actually goes throughout this history. There are a lot of events you can dig deeper that it's not necessarily chronological as we follow these historic events.
so let's talk about the
Incident with the giant, real quick, before we run out of time, so we can get through this verse. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. What a better place to train a king than to put him as a servant in the house of the king. Okay? And that's what David would be. And actually, that's another explanation. Although Saul seems to know David's name and the name of his family here in chapter 16, don't forget, when David comes to play the harp for Saul, he's just a peon in the court. Okay? He's just some shepherd musician that's come to soothe Saul. So, while Saul may have written to Jesse, yes, send your son, he's still just a servant, okay? And, what's happening here, you're absolutely right. What's happening here is the training of David to be the leader of the people. In much the same way that God saved Moses, and Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt to come back and be the leader of the people. I mean, think of how he was raised. And it's really interesting because in those verses in Exodus where Moses says, who am I to go and lead your people? Well, you were a prince of Egypt, for crying out loud. Who else would I send? That's the way I read those verses in Exodus. Another one, yeah, same type of thing. Esther trained to be a leader. Yes, all of them. All these are good examples of that. So the first thing about David and Goliath. We're definitely not going to get through this tonight, but this is really good stuff, and I want to spend some time on it. And we won't have class on Sunday because we'll have our meeting with Brother Brownlee, and so he'll be in the class doing something else. So we'll come back to this next week. When Samuel anoints David, in verse 13 of chapter 16, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward." Now, it's not very hard for me to imagine in verse 23. Here's David. David's come and he's delivered the supplies to his brothers and to the captains and the supply officer of the army. I always have a special connection with that. David left his supply. This is verse 22. We're over in chapter 17 now. David left the supplies in the hands of the supply keeper, the supply officer, the supply keeper, and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, and so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, were dreadfully afraid. And David spoke to the men who was saying, "What shall be done for the..." Yeah, this is where he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Now, what do you know about David when he hears Goliath make his speech? "Send me a man to fight and come challenge me." And David says, who is this guy that's defying the armies of Israel? What's in his head? He has the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is a point. Now, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that because it takes away from David's bravery. But if you're reading this passage and you're thinking, "Oh, there's too much bravado here for this to be real," no, the Spirit of the Lord is on David. Of course, that's going to give him a little bit of confidence, a little bit of bravado, a little bit of courage, wouldn't you think? Yeah, go ahead, Gordon.
I think about Caleb and said, different spirit, because he was the one, he and Joshua, let's get in there and get this done.
Yeah, and let's get in here and get this done. So they hear David. Of course, he likes hearing all the rewards that are going to come about from killing the Philistine. And they bring him before Saul, and we've kind of already read that about David telling Saul about how he had killed the lion and killed the bear that had come and taken the sheep. And Saul, at verse 38, it said, "Saul clothed David with his armor and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, but he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, 'I cannot walk in these, for I have not tested them.' And so David took them off. And he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag and in the pouch which he had. And the sling was in his hand, and he drew near to Goliath." So, when God works great things, and he works great things through not so great people, I've said this before, when God needs something special done, he usually calls nobody to do it. And by that I mean he goes and finds a nobody, somebody who's nobody is special, nobody that anyone knows. When God needs somebody special to do something, he usually calls a nobody to do it. Okay, and here's David, who, yes, he's been anointed, chosen by God, but he's still basically a nobody. The youngest of his family, a shepherd. Okay, so he can play the harp. He even played the harp for the king, but he's nobody. When God chooses to make great things happen, he really makes it spectacular. Here is David, who's going to go out and fight the giant with no sword, with no armor, with no helmet, with nothing but a shepherd's sling and 5 stones that he fished out of the creek in front of the battlefield. All right, we'll talk some more about this Wednesday. There's some other applications here.
about David's preparation, about God's providence here. And let me say this. When David takes down Goliath, and I tell you, read this passage as it literally comes to you. I read this as this is no miracle. Okay? This is not a miraculous thing that happens. Yes, it's miraculous in that God is with David and God delivers David, but no miracle occurs here that I can see. Let's talk some more about that Wednesday. Think about that, and let's have some comments about that next week. Thank you.
That did it. Yeah, if you'll take your seats in just a moment, we'll begin here. We'll sing number 208, and we'll have our small invitation, our 5-minute invitation. At the end of that, we'll sing a song of invitation that'll be number 320. Will Jesus Find Us Watching? So that'll be after our talk this evening. For that, we'll sing all 3 verses, number 208. No, no, so sing to me of heaven, sing that song of peace from the toils that bind me, it will bring release. Burdens will be lifted, our resting soul shall
Good evening. I hope class was productive for everybody. This is usually the part where everybody, makes the joke about, I'm going to make sure it's not over 5 minutes, but I will be making that joke. So, I'm young, and I'm having experiences now that I've never had to experience before in my life. Things that many of you have probably experienced for a very, very long time. I've been working 2 jobs for a while now, and working upwards of 40 hours a week for a while, and it has been extremely exhausting. I have been trying to balance work life. I have a girlfriend who lives in Missouri. All my friends are leaving for college. I'm trying to balance all those things, and it's very stressful on me. And I guarantee that many of you feel the stresses of everyday life, just as I do. And if you want to go ahead and turn to John 16:33, that's the verse that we're going to be covering. I'm not going to read it quite yet, but I want to make the point that we are not promised, when we become Christians, to have our lives be peaceful and to be stress-free and to always be easygoing, because we have God, because we have Jesus, everything's fine. That's not what we're promised. In John 16:33, we're actually given, this is right after the disciples, I'm going to go and read verse 29. His disciples said, now you're speaking plainly and not using figurative speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need anyone to question you. This is why we believe that you came from God. So the disciples are thinking, finally, after Jesus just spoke all those things, basically recapping his entire message, the disciples are like, finally, you're not using parables or anything like that. You're just telling us flatly. You're telling me plainly. Down in verse 31, Jesus answered them and said, do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. And verse 33, which is the verse that we're going to be focusing on. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. This is a verse that is extremely powerful. This verse is Jesus saying, hey, I get it. These stresses that get to you on a day-to-day basis, having to deal with temptations and sin and work and having to deal with all these things that flood your mind, they're real. They're real problems. And the Bible acknowledges that the world will have tribulation. He doesn't promise us, oh, if you just believe in me, if you're just baptized, everything's going to get 100% better. Jesus doesn't promise that. But Jesus says that he has overcome the world. And if we believe and we take heart in him, and we obey his commandments, and we obey God's commandments, and strive to be more like Jesus, then we are promised peace, everlasting peace, and eternal life. So, my invitation to you is that if you do not feel like you have this everlasting peace, if you do not feel comfortable in your eternity, please take this seriously and understand that an eternity is a while. And the choices that you make here will affect you so much more than you can imagine in the long run. So, if you're subject to this invitation, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
Happy for the presence of everyone tonight. We have a good crowd tonight, and that's great to see. Hope your Bible class was enjoyable and profitable for you tonight. Sammy, thank you for the invitation. Very, very timely invitation with some of the things that we need to cover tonight. So thank you for the thoughts tonight. I know probably many of you received the email today or heard earlier this week that our sister Stacy Williams passed away very suddenly on Monday. My understanding is she suffered a massive stroke, and death was very, very quick, and certainly a shock to all of us. And Keith and Alexis are doing well as we could expect them to be. Keith wanted us to announce, we had actually met with Keith and Stacy. Most of you probably remember they had worshiped with us, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago or so, and they had left to go back to Seymour, and Keith and his dad Richard had become elders down there. And we had just actually met with Keith and Stacy about a week and a half ago, and they had expressed a desire to place membership with us again. They were wanting to wait just another week or so because Keith's dad Richard is in very poor health, and was going to be moving back to Salem, where some of his other children were going to be taking care of him. So they wanted to wait until then, but with the events of Monday, Keith has asked us to go ahead and announce that he wants to be a part of this congregation and worship with us. So let's be very mindful of Keith and of Alexis as well with their loss, and reach out to them and see if there's anything we can do for them. Some of us can give you their phone number, or Keith's phone number, if you would like to have that. And ironically, my understanding is Stacy was on the phone talking with someone about care for Richard that was going to be happening over the next couple of weeks when this happened. So let's be especially mindful of them and keep them in our prayers. Also, Michelle Clark, I was talking with her earlier today, and then about 5:30 or 6 o'clock, she texted me and said that they had taken Noah to the hospital. He has pneumonia. He had actually been in the hospital earlier this week, Sunday night or Monday night, but he is not doing well at all, and so they took him back to the hospital tonight. I asked her to text me if she had an update, and she has not texted, so I assume they're still going through the process of getting him in the hospital right now. So let's remember Noah as well. Also, I was asked to announce Ethan Walter. He's been in our news and notes for quite a while. He's the 16-year-old that is Noah Hubbard's girlfriend's brother, and he has completed his chemotherapy and is having an MRI tomorrow to see if there's been progress with his condition. So Pat has asked that if we could especially be praying for good results from that, and that things are better for him. Are there any other sick that we need to mention? I meant to text Paul today, and I completely spaced that. Does anybody have an update on Onesimus by any chance? Okay, well, let's go ahead and be mindful of him as well. Hopefully he's doing better. Just a few other announcements. Let's remember our meeting coming up this weekend with Brownlee Reeves. That'll be Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. He will be preaching all three lessons on Sunday, including the Bible class in here. So we'll have the 7th grade on up. We'll be in the auditorium for Bible class, and the rest of the classes, the young classes, will go ahead and go to class. Friday and Saturday especially are going to be lessons that are aimed at the community, aimed at those that have not yet obeyed the Lord. So if you know people that you might be able to bring to that, especially Friday and Saturday, would be very beneficial. Sunday will be things a little more directed at us and how we can improve the things that we are doing. Let's remember too, back on the teachers, if you're teaching a class especially, there's a mistake on the attendance chart. One of our elders makes that out, and the other 7 edit that, and all of us missed it. But the singing for August will be August 31st, which will be 2 weeks from tonight. It's on there as next Wednesday. That is not correct. So we will have classes next Wednesday, and then have singing 2 weeks from tonight. So especially if you're teaching, be aware of that. There's also an elders and deacons meeting scheduled for Sunday at 4 o'clock. So please, if that applies to you, plan on that. And I think that's all the announcements. I was given several at the back. Oh, yes, JD, thank you. We have flyers. Are they on the table back there? We have flyers for the meeting made up that are on the table back there. Avail yourselves to those. Pick those up, pass those out. And, if you have opportunity, we don't have many weekend meetings anymore. So, maybe if you had time on Saturday morning or sometime, it'd be a good time to go out and just pass out some of those flyers if you could, and invite people. Anything else, men, that I overlooked? All right, if not, then I think Jim Zimmerly will be leading some closing prayers. So I'll ask you to stand, and we'll plan on seeing everybody Friday night at 7 o'clock. Excuse me, one other thing I didn't mean to mention. My understanding is that Keith is going to be meeting with the funeral home tomorrow in Salem to try to work out arrangements. So as soon as we know those, we will send out an email with those arrangements as soon as we know something.
Will you bow with me, please? Holy Father in heaven, we rejoice that we've had this day to assemble here this evening to worship you, to open our hearts, to hear your word proclaimed, to study your scriptures, to grow spiritually, to be better servants, to be a brighter light for the message of Jesus in our community. Father, our hearts are heavy for the loss of Stacy Williams. Bless, be with her family, give them comfort and strength in this time of loss and sorrow. Help us to remember that each day is a blessing, that in reality that we're one day closer to living eternally with you. Help us in that effort, that as we share the message of Jesus, that we would grow and would remember that we're seed sowers. It's you that bring the harvest. There are many on our hearts that are suffering from illnesses, undergoing tests, are struggling with continued health problems. May your healing hand and guidance, may your healing hand be upon them, and your guidance with the health professionals that are providing the care, that what is done would be bring the greatest benefit to their improvement and recovery. Father, thank you for this period of fellowship that we've been able to have with each other. As we go forward, help us to remember that we represent Jesus. We represent his message in the communities that we live, and those that we come in contact with. We thank you for your immeasurable love that sent Jesus to the cross. For without his resurrection, we would have a miserable life with no hope. But thank you, Father, for your love that sent him to the cross, that we can live with you eternally someday. Be with us as we go our separate ways. Keep us in safety. Help us to return again. Bless our coming meeting this weekend. We ask this all in your Son's precious name. Amen.